I'm Jen Turner, and I'm the Student Chair and Editor for Research Curate. In addition to posting online written content, we're very keen to conduct podcasts and accept video submissions to our site. Should anyone be interested in joining us for a podcast or a video, then please do feel free to contact us at researchcurate@contacts.beham.ac.uk. This first podcast for Research Curate centres on disability art and some of the challenges within the sector. By discussing a current residency which was established by DASH, Disability Arts in Shropshire, we explore how important such an opportunity is within the art world. Links to appropriate web pages and sites will be made available via the podcast transcript. And you can also find out more about a recent DASH event which focused on available Arts Council funding, again through the Research Curate website. A very warm welcome to our first podcast for Research Curate. Research Curate is a student-led, cross-disciplinary network of researchers and museum professionals. And this network is a collaboration between academic departments and research and cultural collections at the University of Birmingham. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guests for this first podcast. So I'm joined by Mike Layward, the Artistic Director of DASH.
Hi.
And we're also joined by UK artist Anna Berry, who is the first recipient of a DASH Curatorial Commission and the current Curatorial Resident at MAC.
Hello.
So if we could begin, perhaps starting with you, Mike, if you could tell us more about DASH. So what is DASH and what do you do?
So DASH is a disability-led disability arts organisation working in the visual arts. So disability-led means that our management board and our staff are majority of disabled people. Disability arts is art made by disabled people, and it's also a political movement that went along with the civil rights movement of disabled people. And visual arts is a very broad term. We're based in Shropshire. We work across the West Midlands, the whole Midlands, and further afield across England and even the UK.
Great. And then Anna, if you could tell us more about the residency and the process of gaining that residency and that award.
So the process, I'd heard of it, but I wasn't going to apply for it because I hadn't ever considered myself in that role or in that light or that as being something I was capable of doing. And it was actually because I was kind of asked to apply and people sort of seemed to have that faith that I might be able to do it. So I gave it a go and then I was very excited to get it.
And could you tell us more about your art as well?
Sure. So my practice is really varied. It tends to be quite political, but not always. It tends to be quite conceptual. I work mostly with installation and build great big things. They're quite often kinetic. I work a lot with ephemera, so things that have a lot of build up front, but then don't last for any amount of time. I work with paper a lot. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of be more precise than that.
And Mike, if I could come back to you, what was it about Anna that you felt was really worthy of the first recipient of the award?
I've always loved Anna's work. When I saw the breathing room, and I didn't have much time in it. It was in the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London in their foyer, so it wasn't in a gallery space. It was in quite an odd context, and there was a public launch happening. So I loved the bizarreness of her work, but the whole process of Anna applying was great. It felt like, we needed to really encourage her to apply, and she just came across with a lot of positivity, a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm for it, and it seemed like, well, that's great because you can't invent that. That's like what you need.
And so, could you tell us more then about the commission itself? So, how that came about? And
okay, we've got quite a long history of doing artist commissions with galleries. We don't have our own space, and there was a time we did have a space. But going down the road of setting up our own gallery didn't seem like a useful way to go because it felt like, are we then just ghettoising disabled artists' work and disability art? So we need to be working with the established galleries around the country and for them to be showing more work by disabled artists. So we would bring money and say want to work with you for you to commission new work by disabled artists at your show as any other artist within your gallery. We realised it would have an impact while the artist was there and working in the gallery, but it was only short term, and once the artist had gone, felt like things weren't changing fast enough. I'm quite impatient. I know that change takes a long time, but I'm quite impatient. And so we were looking and talking with different people within the visual arts world about the role of curators and how key they are for deciding what gets shown in galleries. We felt like this really inward-looking, closed world that if you got in there, great, but if you weren't inside it, would you ever get in? And so that's where the idea of the curatorial residencies came, and we were aware that if there are any disabled curators, they're very, very few. So it's more like a training scheme, but it's a clear partnership with the galleries.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience of the residency so far?
Sure, it's been interesting. The hope is that, if there's disabled presence here at MAC, that somewhere that will filter out to other institutions and kind of normalise that a little bit more, rather than that being, that kind of slightly ghettoised niche thing that we find ourselves driving into all the time as disabled artists. There's a kind of very parallel stream of getting disabled arts funding and very little crossover. Like my piece shown in the Queen Elizabeth Foyer Hall, that's really great, but there's still not a single gallerist or curator in the land who will ever have seen it or know anything about my work. I think partly the history of disabled arts comes in some ways in quite a performative kind of place, and a lot of the models that you find in the disabled arts world when it comes to funding are based on kind of theatre and performance models that can be hard to crowbar yourself into as a visual artist, and so you can be not quite at home in the disability arts world. It's almost like in some ways it's quite a young world itself, and they're trying to figure out what to do with visual artists, and they don't have the connections yet really to do things like network us.
Obviously Dash has been part of some significant change already, but where do we see changes taking place? Where do we want changes to take place? And trying to narrow the gap between those two worlds as you described them.
Well, I think following on from what Anna said, I think the curatorial residencies are the thing that's different between that and having an artist commission is that actually you're a member of staff, and that's really different. An artist will come and work with the gallery staff and the technicians, but they're not going to be in your office every day for over a year. You're not going to have their presence. But actually some of these things are just about actually doing it, and it's maybe not about more pieces of writing, it's actually about the practical. That's what I really believe in, is about practical application, practical action. Mm-hmm. That's what actually makes change, because it's not about reading things and intellectualizing, it's about the emotional and the physicality of what happens when a person is present. So a disabled curator being present in your staff, things change. It's not like they have come in to make the change, because the organisations have to make the change, but it will change by just that, the presence.
It's almost like performance art piece in and of itself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I come into the space and the space changes. I think that there's also real structural issues within the fine art world to do with the kind of traditional roots in and things like CVs and art schools and being near London and going to openings and making yourself known and networking, and there's this really standard route in, and that it is almost impossible to do it any other way, and there's a number of reasons why that route in isn't accessible to a lot of disabled people on a whole manner of levels. And the advent of digital stuff is helping that a little bit, because a lot of curators are looking a lot at Instagram and things like that and finding artists there. But yeah, obviously there's accessibility issues even for that, because a lot of artists won't be able to kind of promote their work on the internet for one reason or another. So I feel like there has to be some kind of more seismic shift in that almost very old-fashioned idea of there's this one way into this career and you work your way up in this particular fashion ladder that hasn't revolutionised at all in the fine art world.
That's really interesting stuff, because I've already been thinking about what's the next step after these 3 curatorial residencies. and we better show some impact of change through that for the individuals and for the organisations. But it feels like it's got to go out much bigger now from this, and it's got to be a network of between 6 to 10 sort of leading galleries across England who will take responsibility to make those changes within the whole organisation, and also by having curators in residence and looking at artists' commissions. But also, I think it's really important what you've just said, to start looking at the whole processes that they work with. So it's having a very self-critical network that can start stepping back and actually saying, is there other ways we can do this? On very basic levels, we've been looking at accessible call-out processes and application processes. I still think the basic way that artists or people get jobs is through interviews, which don't work for a lot of people. I think could ask 9 out of 10 people and they would all say, I hate interviews, I get so nervous, I say all the wrong things. And it's an awful position to put people in. We haven't found a better way yet, but we're at least trying to look, because I think particularly for artists, why are we asking them to go through a process which isn't their best way? Some artists are great to talk about themselves and their work, but most artists want their work to do that. And if they have to talk about it, I'm sure people like Hockney would have got nowhere if he had to always just talk about his work early on.
It's definitely one of the problems, probably more so in the contemporary art world than ever before, that you need to have this kind of articulation verbally and in writing of your work and how you think your work is relevant to this call out or that call out. And for a lot of us, it's just not a skill we have. And certainly for me, my success in applications has mostly been when there's an access fund, when I can get someone from outside who can do that kind of stuff. And without that, really, I mean, even the small amount of ground I've managed to kind of cover wouldn't have happened. So it's a very odd thing. And moreover, you have to do it in their kind of language and terminology and their set of overarching theories, if you like, for it to make sense to them. And actually, sometimes a lot of what people are saying absolutely can be rephrased in those kind of curatorial speaks to completely appeal. But again, it should be the curator that's doing that, not requiring, the artist to kind of come all the way into their world to do that. They should be kind of stepping outside and bringing the artist into that world rather than kind of the current expectation. I mean, I'm generalising, I'm sure a lot of curators are not like this, but I'm also quite jaded from being on the art scene for a long time and having a lot of failed applications and realising that they are poor applications because I don't do it very well and I'm never going to do it very well. Well, certainly what I learned quite quickly is that you have to decouple the idea of good art from successful art. So all these other skills about how you're framing your work, who you're coming into contact with, these are the things that are kind of dictating really how far you get in the art world. And for a lot of artists, that doesn't matter. They're not particularly necessarily ambitious. They want to have enough money to make the work, and they want to make the work. That's it. We don't all want to win the Turner Prize, but actually, to even be able to do that, to earn your basic crust, you still sort of required to kind of have this quite rarefied skill set to go along with just making art.
It is very complex, and also I think the thing about change is not only is it a slow process, but I think it can be a very uncomfortable process, so people have got to be open to feeling uncomfortable because they're going to be challenged by that.
Issues to do with things like social media. I mean, is there expectations there that you feel you have to be present on social media and you have to do those things?
And that's again one of the areas in which you can either see it as having got easier or having got more difficult for artists, because on the one hand, if you're struggling to get access and you're good at social media, suddenly you've got a sort of public shopfront that anybody can see you on. So that's been brilliant for a lot of artists. For artists that aren't so great at it or have accessibility issues for social media, it's just become another pressure. And I think for artists in general, there used to be this kind of old guard gallery system whereby the gallery was essentially your agent and they were promoting you and doing all of that stuff in your marketing. And now, a little bit like the music business, it's the other way around. You won't get representation unless you come with your 17,000 Instagram followers to bring to the party. So they're kind of requiring you to have already done all that upfront, created your brand, got your following, and then, you know,
bring that to them.
Yeah. So, you know, if you were desperately invisible and you are so excited because you want to be signed by a gallery and then they're going to help you make your way, it doesn't really work like that anymore. But the kind of dominion of these kind of white cubes is kind of crumbling. So many of them are closing, and I think that's sad in a lot of ways, but I don't know, maybe it's progress and helps with accessibility in other ways because they could be very exclusive kind of places. So I think the art world's in a little bit of an in-between place because gallerists don't have the money to kind of have a bricks and mortar shopfront like that anymore, and there was this kind of hegemony and now it's fading and we haven't quite found where we are now. Like a lot of things in the digital age, we're in this kind of strange transition phase. So there are gallerists who will go to lots and lots of art fairs and that's what they do, but they don't have a bricks and mortar place to be anymore. People are forging new models, I guess.
So interesting.
Thank you.
So one of the other things that I had wanted to come back to from when you were speaking earlier as well was about terminology. I think that is in itself a really interesting topic and discussion within the heritage sector, but beyond that as well. So you use the term invisibility to talk about people feeling invisible as part of this world, as part of the visual arts world. And I just wonder, what are the next steps to move forward to narrow this gap between the traditional route, as you called it, and the non-traditional route? Sorry, that's really tricky. Feel free to break that up.
Higher education, art education, and I remember Hockney talking in I think it was the early 80s, he said him and his mates wouldn't have got to art school. They weren't writers, they weren't able to write about themselves. And it's really interesting, a huge number of artists are dyslexic, and somehow they're forcing themselves through this very hard academical process of writing about themselves and the art and putting themselves in this very intellectual process which will be going against their impairment. So that has got to change, but it feels like probably the opposite is happening. I'm glad to hear there's things like practice-based MAs and even practice-based PhDs happening, which does seem to be going against the grain. So maybe there's, you know, like all things never change linear fashion. I know that we work with a lot of self-taught artists who probably, whatever that right term is there for an artist who hasn't been through higher education, a lot of disabled artists don't because they just can't get through the process. Going way back in their primary and secondary education, it will have probably been really hard for them to have had much support and success through that your confidence is shattered. So to then think you want to put yourself through a 3-year degree.
But I do think this is going to confuse matters and is probably going to be an annoying thing to say. But we have to stress that just because we're saying all of this doesn't mean we think that things should be dumbed down for us. And that's a danger if we say, well, why are you using this difficult terminology? You know, then that's the other kind of trap that you fall into, is saying, well, you should accept my art when it's actually not because I'm disabled, not because it's as good a quality as the other art you're showing. And that's kind of really patronising and absolutely not where we want to be going with this. We'd want to maintain that we are actually creating art, you know, of a great standard that absolutely can compete on its own rights with art that non-disabled people are creating. So we might be talking about trying to use more open language or trying to frame things differently, but what we're not saying is we want you to make it easier for us, or that we should be able to get somewhere that actually our art on its own merit wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Yeah. So that's worth mentioning, I think.
Absolutely, yeah, because that would be undermining the whole purpose of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of trap that disability arts falls into, is that people tend to think that, well, this is obviously not art that could have made it on its own. There's a lot of kind of stigma. And I think the only way that you can get past that is to keep absolutely demonstrating excellence. And it's the way it is. I think you almost have to be better in some ways so that you can show people that you're not expecting some kind of special favour, from coming into the disability sector.
As somebody who's not in the field at all, it's really interesting to hear how difficult it actually is. But at the same time, it's good to know that there are positive things happening, like the Dash residency and even the Arts Council funding opportunities that they have, which include access support workers. That's a really fantastic thing as well.
Yeah, I kind of got to a point where I almost just thought it's not worth me applying for anything unless there's an access fund, because a lot of artists that I sit and talk to say that it's a numbers game. So they go to a coffee shop of a morning and they make 50 applications, but they're sending off roughly the same work because maybe they've got painting practice and this is just what their work looks like. But if you have a sort of installation practice and a conceptual practice, then there isn't a one-size-fits-all template. So every time I do an application, it's days and days and days of kind of heart-rending, head-splitting work. And the idea that I could just pump off 50 of those, is not ever going to happen. And then I have such a sort of poor strike rate because I do it quite poorly. So for someone like me, as soon as something like the Arts Council, for example, that has an accessibility fund, that I can kind of get someone who's better at that than me and to do it, then great, I've got a chance, because I can sort of say, well, actually, in a much clearer terms, this is what I want to do, and this is what I think it'll fit. But in fact, the majority of places don't have an access fund for applications.
So yeah, it's good credit to the Arts Council. Their system was inaccessible, and nearly everyone finds it really hard to navigate, but disabled people found it as good as impossible. They could have just shrugged their shoulders on that, but they created the Access Fund. So out of it has actually come a real positive, and the potential acknowledgement that something as simple as someone having an access support worker is going to make massive difference. The artist has to create the idea and the work and do it, but just that support makes a huge difference.
So fingers crossed that what the Arts Council have done creates a much wider positive change with other organisations that maybe at the moment are not very accessible for disabled artists. But maybe we can just kind of close off by thinking about what can be done in the future. So what would you like to see done in the arts sector?
Anna brought up a really interesting point when you were talking about the changes within, say, particularly the visual arts, because I think the visual arts is quite a world on its own. It's quite different to the theatre sector. If you look at the theatre sector, there is a commercial theatre sector like the West End or Broadway, but its influence on the subsidised theatre world is much less. People want to see a show go to the West End or Broadway. It's still a different thing where the private art world is this sort of hidden beast, and it's like a very, very narrow triangle where there's a lot of artists at the bottom struggling or giving up as artists, and then the pinnacle at the top is really narrow. And I would just like to see either that triangle disappear or it becomes much broader.
That's because of the inherent connection to the art market, and how a lot of the people who are buying are not buying because of the art, they're buying to invest.
Absolutely.
And it gets shut away in some vault somewhere. But then that completely manipulates what's being shown elsewhere. And then there are all sorts of cases of people opening kind of semi-public museums that are actually of their own private collections in order to boost, because if you boost the visibility of someone, you also boost their price. And so they're showing the art to the public, and actually what they're doing is increasing the value of their private collections by increasing the collectability of what they own. So there's this really kind of relationship between just making art and trying to get people to be interested in it, and actually this kind of what is actually quite a kind of hidden world of investors, and even down to what interests them. And because a lot of art essentially is tracing the art market instead of being divorced from the art market. So I think that would be a great change to make, to have the art that's shown be fundamentally irrelevant to art that is collectible and investable.
Great. Do you want to say a little bit about Dash, just where we could find some information?
Yeah. So Dash's website is www.dasharts.org. My email address is mike@dasharts.org. Also, one of the things we do is to support artists. So I'm really happy to talk to people about any ideas they've got, any support they want, any questions.
Fantastic. And I know I will be going back onto your site, but if you can tell us where we can find more information about yourself.
Sure, it's annaberry.co.uk.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you both so much. This was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Once again, our sincere thanks to our guests for this really interesting podcast. Over the year, we hope to record further podcasts on a variety of subjects relating to object-based research, curatorial practice, working within the heritage sector, and much more. Our next scheduled podcast will look at two particular collections of ancient objects, which are currently held at the University of Birmingham. And for this, I'll be joined by Dr. Maeve McHugh, Teaching Fellow in Classical Archaeology within the College of Arts and Law. For any queries or to discuss potential future content for Research Curate, please don't hesitate to contact us at researchcurate@contacts.beham.ac.uk.